Alrighty, world history students, here we are. We are beginning our new unit on the Greeks and the Romans. And so first up are the ancient Greeks. And we have here a lecture on Homer, the teacher of Greece, dating to about 1250 BC. So we are moving forward in our timeline, and let's go ahead and jump right in. This lecture should give you an overview of the main ideas for this week, as well as answering the questions on slides 3 through 5. Okay, here we go. First, some background on Homer, not Homer Simpson, uh, but the guy who he was named for. And so, first of all, the historical Homer we know very little about. Again, dating back to the 13th century BC, or around 800, the 700s, the 8th century BC. There's 7 cities that claim that he lived with them, that he was part of their, that was his hometown. One of those being the island of Chio. He was thought to have been blind, and to have been a bard, who was basically, a bard was like a singer in the service of a king. So it's kind of not like a court jester, but more of the theatrical version, or more of the singing version. And so what that would be is, you'd be a king and you would have a bard who would be in your court, and he would tell you, he'd be a storyteller basically, except these storytellers were in meter, and then they'd oftentimes be sung. They'd be done from memory. And so that many people believe potentially that's who Homer was. Now, the word Homer also came to be so synonymous with just the idea of even a traveling poet. And so some people even speculate whether there was actually, whether his name was actually Homer, or if there was an author of these famous Greek stories that we're going to talk about in a minute. And they just called him Homer because that just represents a traveling poet generally. But he also might have been so famous that his name became synonymous with anybody who told these great epic tales. So still pretty clouded in mystery for being as famous as he is. Now, why is he famous? Well, there's 2 most famous epic poems: the Iliad and the Odyssey. Iliad being the story of Achilles and his war his battles in the Trojan War to regain his Helen for the Greeks, and the Odyssey being the story of Odysseus, as he attempts to return home after the Trojan War, back to his family, and goes through various adventures throughout the Mediterranean Sea. These stories were at first just an oral tradition. That's one reason, if you study them, you'll see that there's a lot of mnemonic devices that help you with memorization. They were not written down until around the 2nd century BC, so the hundreds. So for hundreds of years, these stories were memorized and recited, and who knows, perhaps adapted and embellished, we're not sure. But they weren't actually written texts until about the 100s BC. They were pretty much thought of as like the official textbooks of early Greek children, to be taught the values and the virtues and kind of the history and the mythology and the lore of ancient Greece. These 2 stories were almost kind of like the Greek Bible, not in such an intense religious sense, but they were the stories that every child would know in order to be brought up as a true Greek member of Greek culture. And if you actually read the stories, they don't necessarily, obviously don't read a lot like a modern epic, but they're really a series of speeches. And that what you have is, there'll be a little bit of a description of what's happening, and then a character will pretty much just start talking and start describing what they're doing and why they're doing it, and even what they're doing. And so the majority of the text is dialogue. And that just emphasizes something really key to Greek culture, and that is the power of rhetoric, which was the power of human beings alone from animals to use their words to communicate, to reason, to better construct reality by dialoguing and conversing with one another. We're going to talk about that a little later, but this ability to speak, the Greeks really thought, set human beings apart. And then our ability to speak with each other really allowed us to arrive at higher truths than any other animals. And so they highlight this in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the ability to be persuasive, to demonstrate virtues by what you say, and of course also to teach and to pass along knowledge from one person or one generation to the next. So language and its ability to exhibit man's ability to think. They said, we have this ability to reason in our minds, and then we have the ability of logos or rhetoric to speak out that reasoning and refine it through conversation with other people. The Iliad basically translates as the story of Ilium, which is just another name for the famous city of Troy. Again, the city that is both a historical as well as kind of mythological city on the coast of Turkey, to which the famous Helen is kidnapped by the Trojans and her lover Paris, and then the Greeks send an army to take her back. They believe, again, Troy is a real historical city, and they do think that these conflicts between the Greeks and the Trojans of Turkey were real wars, though they might have been multiple conflicts, kind of all conflated into one, epic story. And the Iliad is the foremost example of a tragedy. I'd say similar to Epic of Gilgamesh in that it has a sad ending. It doesn't turn out well for the hero, and we'll talk about that when we get into the story specifically. Its counterpart, which we're going to discuss less, is the Odyssey, and that's, again, as I already said, the journey of one of these soldiers, Odysseus, back to Greece after the wars. And that one is a comedy, not because it's funny, but because it has a happy ending. Comedy for the Greeks, there were two main genres, and there was tragedy and comedy. And tragedy was simply the hero fails in their, usually because of a fatal flaw in their character, whereas the hero in a comedy overcomes that fatal flaw and is able to achieve success. And so you have the Iliad on kind of part one being a tragedy, and part two, the Odyssey, being a comedy. Hence, you have the two masks there, representing those two types of stories. Though the Greeks did also have satire and slapstick comedy, as we know of it as well. Okay, just to get some geographic bearings, this is the nation of Greece, on the far eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. And so you can see Mycenae. That's where Helen is going to be kidnapped in this story, and kidnapped and taken across the Aegean Sea over there to Troy, where then all the Greeks will assemble an army. Her enraged husband, Menelaus, will rally all the other kings of the various cities of Greece, and then take them over to siege Troy and win back his wife, and Greek honor by destroying the city. Representation of what the city of Troy might have looked like. Typical walled city, 13th century. These are the remains, the actual excavation points of the historical city of Troy. Whether there was a historical Paris and historical Achilles and Helen, that we cannot confirm. Okay, so just a little background on the characters of the Iliad. And in this lecture, I'm actually not going to go into a whole lot of detail because it could end up being really long, because it's an epic story. An epic just like we had with Gilgamesh. Now we have a Greek epic, but there's a video linked to this lecture, the slide, that's a short 2.5-minute overview of the story. And so be sure to watch that along with this lecture so that you can fully understand kind of the story and the broad scope of the Iliad as a epic poem or epic story. But the main characters are Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Patroclus. They are the Greeks, so they are the attackers. They are the besiegers of the city, trying to win back Helen. The main character is Achilles. Achilles is the foremost skilled warrior of the Greeks, and he is leading the charge. He is the one they need on their side, and whenever Achilles fights, they're winning, and whenever Achilles doesn't fight for various reasons, they lose. And so Achilles, and really it's the Achilles rage, it's Achilles' inability to control his emotion and growing angry at everybody, really, not only the Trojans, but also his fellow Greeks. That is kind of the theme. And the larger theme is this human emotion of rage becoming this feeding component to the larger slaughter and horror of what war is. And the Iliad really is kind of a tragic picture, like maybe a war picture that you watch, and it's not really, while it might be exciting, it's not really, and there's heroic things that happen, but it's not really saying war is great. It shows you what war is and all its horrors, and you think, man, war is horrible. Good things can happen. There's heroes, but it's a terrible thing. And that really is kind of the central theme of the Iliad, which is Achilles and his rage, and how it furthers and exacerbates the suffering of both the Greeks and the Trojans in this terrible 10-year. It's actually supposed to be a 10-year war, and this Iliad actually takes place just kind of right in the middle of that. I won't get into the other characters other than to say that Menelaus is the husband of Helen, who is seeking to win her back, and Patroclus, his death is going to be important because it's his death. He's the best friend of Achilles, and when Patroclus is killed, that's when Achilles reaches the peak of his rage, and then goes on and vows to fight against the Trojans, even though he knows that if he does this, it's going to lead to his own death. But at that point, he doesn't care. He's so angry, he's willing to go and slaughter his enemies, particularly this guy Hector, we'll talk about next, even if it means it's going to cost him his own life. And so Patroclus is kind of that key turning point for Achilles. That metal mask, by the way, is the death mask of Agamemnon, who's another key king in the story. But again, there, we do believe was a historical figure because they've excavated a tomb back in ancient Greece where they believe that it might have been the historical Agamemnon being buried. The other side, the Trojans' key characters, is you have Hector. Hector is the counterpoint to Achilles. On the Trojan side, he's the leader of the city. He's very virtuous. He's portrayed as being kind of like he's kind of the best character of the entire story. He's very noble. He's trying to serve his people. He's trying to protect them, even though again he also knows that that's eventually going to lead to his death. Um, and he is the one who eventually he kills Patroclus. So he kills Achilles' best friend, thinking Patroclus is Achilles, and then Achilles seeks revenge on him and eventually kills him. Achilles killing Patroclus is what's depicted in this face here. This scene here is the one you're going to read from our primary source book, and that is Hector saying goodbye to his wife and young son prior to going to battle, even though he knows that he's going to die in this battle. And his son, kind of representing peace, is terrified of his father because he's wearing this scary warlike crested helmet. And then Hector's saddened by that, so he takes his helmet off so his son will see that he actually is his father. And anyway, there's a lot of deep, sweet, tender moment of what war does to us, and what it masks. But anyway, this is that scene where he's saying goodbye to his family, knowing his death is imminent. Paris, he's the one who kidnaps Helen, who some story, whether who Helen is in love with. Andromache, that's the woman there, that's the wife of Hector, and Priam is Hector's father, who's going to also figure prominently in the second reading you guys do in our textbook, because he survives to, once Hector is killed by Achilles, Priam goes to Achilles to beg him to have his son's body back, because Achilles not only kills Hector in his rage, but in defiance of all cultural norms, he drags and mutilates his body and takes it back as a prize. That was a big deal to the Greeks, the ability to recover their dead and bury them with honor. Achilles denies that to Hector, and Priam has to go and beg, as an old man, beg the murderer of his son to can he please have his body back? And again, you'll be reading that from our textbook. This I'm going to skip over these slides. These go over the key stages of the story, but you can get these from the video rather than narrate it all here. I decided to link the short video, so I'll jump through these. Well, yeah, okay. Tempted. It's a great story. I want to talk about it, but I don't want to make this video too long. This is the key moment, though, where Achilles is going to kill Hector in his rage, and Priam has to then return. You see that battle on the left, and on the right is Priam begging Achilles for his son's body back. And that's actually where the story ends. The last end of the story is not the destruction of Troy. That's told kind of in foreshadow. It's also told in other legends, but the Iliad itself doesn't even, actually, it's kind of the middle of the story. It again, Priam begs for the body of his son back, but then it's prior to the city actually being destroyed. The whole story of the Trojan horse and all of that. It also doesn't tell the story of Paris kidnapping Helen. That's kind of, again, backstory left out. It starts right in the middle of the action. Okay, so what are some of the virtues and themes that this story, and again, we talked about the Iliad and Odyssey being kind of the textbooks for ancient Greek. They kind of encapsulate everything it meant to be Greek, and they used it to teach, the children and subsequent generations what their values. And three major ones that I want to highlight are, one is this idea of arete. Arete is a Greek word, and it would translate as excellence. And then that was kind of the highest goal of a Greek person, was to achieve excellence, was to be the absolute best they could be, both whether it was morally, physically brave, whether it was intelligence. Again, these are the inventors of the Olympics, where they specifically wanted to honor feats of physical skill, and kind of crown the winner, who was the most physically specimen among them. But it wasn't just the physical. It wasn't even just combat. It was also, they had this thing called metis, which was cleverness, and they wanted to be the most clever in their mind. They wanted to be the most excellent in their speech. And like I said, the Iliad and the Odyssey have a lot of speeches in them, but also we're going to be reading guys like Socrates and Plato, and again, a lot of the arguments put together in their court system, in Greek court systems, are just famous because they really honored the ability to think and communicate, and then to act physically with bravery. They saw that human beings were capable of a lot, and that's what these heroes within the Iliad and the Odyssey were meant to embody, both what could be achieved, and also if you have flaws, how that might thwart you in your efforts to achieve arete. And all of that leads into the second key idea, this idea of humanism. That Greeks, what they really, one of the key things they add to Western civilization is this idea of human potential. They did not see themselves as the dregs of the gods' creation of the world. They did not see themselves as even the slaves to the gods. They didn't see themselves as the, you know, should they should be inferior to anything. What they saw in human beings was potential, that human beings and their faculty to think and speak, their ability for physical bravery, their ability to coordinate and form governments, that they were capable of amazing things. And so that's one reason you see such achievement in Greek culture, is that was something they actively and consciously cultivated, because they believed there was no limit to what human beings could achieve. That being said, well, I'll talk about that in another slide. Secondly, linked to this is this idea of logos, as Mr. Newsleep would say, though I always say logos. I don't mind being wrong. But logos, and this is the ability to reason, the ability to use your mind to discern the truth. And that'll be actually a whole nother lecture on that. But that was embodied in these, again, these speeches that run throughout throughout lots of texts, but especially the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that was, again, the ability of human beings, not just to be physically and use our muscles and our bodies for amazing things, but for us to use our minds and our words to tame animals, to cease wars, to persuade and change another person's mind, and win them over to your cause. And so that was, again, really important in Greek culture, to learn to be a clear thinker and a clear speaker. A couple other key themes is, again, this balance of death and glory. The key choice of Achilles in the Iliad is he has this prophecy, and what the prophecy tells him is that if he leaves the war, he will live to a long old age. He'll marry, he'll have kids, and he'll live in peace, and he'll die in peace on some far removed Greek island and enjoy the rest of his life. The only cost is that if he were to stay, he would die, but he would achieve eternal glory. And so Achilles is balancing this typical Greek mindset of, would I rather live a long life of peace, but obscurity, where nobody knows my name, I have no reputation, I'm not famous, no one's ever going to know about me after I die, or will I have a short life, but a short and glorious life, where I lay down my life and, in thousands of years, kids at Coastal Christian School are still going to be talking about me, because I want that glory. And it's kind of this debate, which would we rather have, death or glory? Or, life or glory, really. And again, I've already mentioned the revenge and the rage and the destruction of that. They were trying to achieve arete and perfection. They were very aware of flaws. Greeks were very self-conscious and self-observant, trying to figure out, well, what's the best way to live? What's the best way to act? What's the best way to achieve these things? What works and what doesn't? And so that's one reason why the Iliad really highlights the rage of Achilles, because it's a character flaw that actually increases a lot of human suffering. And the word for the fatal flaw, which I think my little screen might be, fortunately, kind of blocking this. Let me move it. The fatal flaw is this word hamartia. And the word hamartia means to miss the mark. The idea that you're aiming for something. Hey, wait, we've already seen this. Hamartia in the Bible means sin. And it was actually, again, a Greek concept also, where the Bible then incorporates the word, because it basically meant you're supposed to be aiming for something, but you're missing it. Your aim in life is off. And so Achilles, in succumbing to his rage, he misses the mark. And that actually ends up being his fatal flaw, because in the story, he decides, he's like, this is not worth dying for. I want to go home and live a good life. But he becomes so emotionally angry and enraged at the death of his friend Patroclus that he goes out and fights and says, well, to heck with it. I don't care what happens to me. And that ends up being a huge loss of not only his death, but for more of the Greeks. And so you can see here in this statue, he's looking at the physical manifestation of his fatal flaw, which is the famous Achilles heel, which, legend had it that his mother dipped him in this protective river, but held him by his heel so that he had one spot on his body from which he could be wounded and killed. That's a physical example of hamartia, but that, even in the poem, that's shown to be just the representation of, that's only exposed physically because of what his emotional or his character flaw, which is his rage. And so this idea of Greeks, where they said, you want to achieve arete, you need to watch out for sin. You need to watch out for hamartia, because human beings, as as much as we have amazing potential, we also have these flaws that can destroy us and lead us to destruction. Um, Two other just things to point out is one, embodied in that choice by Achilles of whether he wants eternal glory or a long peaceful life, is this balance of social versus personal good. And that's another theme running throughout the story. And the Greeks were a very social people. We're going to talk about their political structures. They were very thoughtful in terms of how should we organize society and what are my duties to myself, what are my duties to my fellow Greeks, to outsiders. And they were always dealing with this idea of social versus personal good. Do I do what's good for me, or do I do what's good for the society or the city, or what they would call the polis? And so that's again, for Achilles, he said one of the thought was, do I go home and serve my own personal future, or do I stay and die and serve the larger social good of helping the Greeks win this war? And embodied also within all of this is an ambivalence or an uncertainty, kind of similar to the Sumerians and the ancient Near East towards their gods, because the gods, the famous gods Athena and Aphrodite and Zeus, and the famous Greek Hermes, the famous Greek pantheon of gods, they play a very active role in this story. And balanced with that idea of humanism, that human beings have this amazing potential, is this sense that the gods are standing in their way. And when you actually read the story of whether Achilles killing Hector, or some of the other deaths of the hero, or even eventually when Achilles is killed, the gods are intervening. The gods are getting in the way. The gods are providing. This is what this picture is a god intervening in human affairs. They're going at it according to their own arete and potential, but then the gods would come in and kind of put their finger on the scales and tip things out of balance. And the Greeks were kind of frustrated by that. They had this sense of, there's these gods and they're powerful, but you know what? They're not fair, and that they're getting in our way and they're preventing us from achieving what we could normally achieve through our own potential. And we're going to revisit that, but that's an important thing to introduce, because they didn't feel necessarily fully supported or in favor of their gods, and they kind of, you know, chafed against this idea that these powerful deities would get involved and influence the decisions they were trying to make on their own. Oh, and last one. So what? Just again, we want to know Homer and his influence on not only the Greek culture, but also Western literature, their education and their values. He is kind of just the sage of Greece, and in some ways the sage of Western civilization, because these stories are just continue to be beautiful and just rich in themes and character development and what they teach us about human nature. And then, of course, you want to know, get very familiar with this idea of humanism, the idea that humans have potential, that humans are of inherent worth. It definitely parallels that idea of the Jews in Genesis, of the humans being made in God's image and having this ability to rule and reign. And that's where the Greeks and the Jews are going to kind of find common cause in how they see mankind versus the other cultures of the ancient Near East. And finally, this idea of rhetoric, the power of man's reason. That's going to we're going to be talking about that a lot, but just the ability to say, you know what, human beings are not just other creatures. They have this faculty of the mind and of the speech that can absolutely change the world, which is a very interesting concept when you consider how God brought the whole world, according to the Hebrews, according to the Jews in the Bible, brought the whole world into being with his very words. And so another key connection between the Greek and Jewish views of the world is just the power of language, and how human beings, in their ability to speak and reason, almost are godlike. Alrighty, we'll cut it off there and leave you to the next lecture. See you soon.